Hello, it's Eric Westgard, Amateur Call NY90. Welcome to the Minnesota ARES Volunteer Training Series. This time we're talking about event readiness for amateur radio volunteers. So the definition for the purpose of this training is events, things like bike races, bike fundraisers, 5K, 10K, running races, half marathons, parades, that sort of thing. Usually sponsored by nonprofit organizations, usually we are reporting in to the medical director and providing essentially what's called route safety in the bike fundraiser business. So that's the high level overview. And again, I've been doing this for about 25 years. 2 large marathons, one in the top 10, 5Ks, 10Ks, ski races. I have not actually done any parades at this point. So the first thing to do when you're thinking about an event, volunteering for an event, is know the basics. So what is the event purpose? We're doing one in about a week. It's a half marathon and 10K that's in a park, and it's raising money actually for the park foundation. So we kind of get the idea of what they're doing. The sponsorship, this one is sponsored by a nonprofit, and it has some businesses that are donating money and in-kind things like that. You might run into a government-operated event. So, for example, that same park district might have their event, and often at a government event, the volunteers are going to have less autonomy. So you're going to have a very defined role. For example, I volunteer as park patrol, so we're doing first aid and kind of route safety in a very much narrower envelope versus a purely volunteer run event. Normally, for example, the events I volunteer for, I'm in a senior leadership role. It really is kind of the old saying, one riot, one ranger. We're allowed to find problems and literally make decisions to resolve them. Versus if you're on the park patrol, you have a 20-page list of rules and regulations in a much narrower scope, if that makes sense. So know the course, know the start and finish layout. You're going to get questions, and people are going to, if you're wearing a shirt that says you're a volunteer or you're a race official or an event official, people are going to ask questions. You have to be prepared to answer those, or at least direct them to the people that know. So sign up the right way. There's a tendency for hams, and this is not really a bad thing, is to sort of show up and be helpful, and that's good. But in general, you want to use the official volunteer website. Sign the disclaimers. The general concept is, if you're, following the rules and doing the job you're assigned to do, that if anything bad happens, they're supposed to, that situation is supposed to be covered by the insurance policy that the event pulls when they pull their permit. They sign up for an insurance policy. That liability shouldn't be on you. That's kind of the high level. Again, I'm not an attorney. This is just kind of the concept. You should expect checks for things like vehicle insurance if you're driving a van full of 12-year-olds. Same with child safety training. Same with background checks. They don't want you driving a van of 12-year-olds if you have, for example, a DUI conviction. That only seems reasonable. So I think some people get really wrapped around the axle on this, and it's the general idea is you're volunteering, it's their event, it's their insurance, but again, it may vary depending on the event. Be a friendly face. So you're wearing an event, you're going to get questions. So if where's the start line, where's the finish line, when does the event start? I find I get kind of distracted, but it's nice to sort of almost have an index card of some basic frequently asked questions. You can also direct people to the actual information booth if there is one. Stay approachable even when you're busy, and be a visible part of the event team. Don't growl at them and say, "Hey, I'm handling valuable emergency communications," and go away. That's not a good thing. It's just, it's a little 5K, it's a 10K. We're supposed to be having fun out there, and they want cheerful volunteers. Understand the command structure. So usually when hams are involved in, and let's just make up an example of this one we're doing in a couple weeks, you're reporting into it's sort of a dotted line. You're reporting a little bit to the medical department. There's a medical director, as well as to the race director. And here are some kind of typical jobs. So the race director, really top level leader, responsible for all aspects of the race. There may be an executive director, there might be a president, But in general, it's the race director, and they're the decision maker. And in our incident command, they would be the incident commander on behalf of the event. The course director manages the course setup. Signage is really important. Where do you turn left? Where do you turn right? Where are the water stops, water stations? Coordination with the police or city services in terms of road closures and barricades, things like that. Volunteer coordinator assigns volunteers. The safety or medical director coordinates emergency services, and that's usually where we report in more directly. We're often coordinating supplies, athlete and gear, carts or vans, or just making sure when someone goes down on the course or drops out, they get the support they need, the care they need, and that may not come from us, but it comes from those volunteers. Sponsorship and fundraising, really the business side of the event. Even if it's a nonprofit, we're generally not involved in that. Communications is a funny term. They're not talking about radio communications, they're talking about public relations and media relations and social media and things like that. And then registration is managing the runners sign up. There's this notion of a race packet and getting people their bibs or wristbands and race day check-ins. Just some jargon and some lingo from this part of the world. So you may be dismayed to see you were assigned radio tools that are not ham radio. They're not your radio. And you may want to say, look, I'm here to use my radios and Part 97 frequencies, all that sort of thing. So for example, in my experience, marathons and running races like to rent voice radios, and because they like the immediacy, the situational awareness, the fact that hey, the first runner has passed mile 4 or whatever everyone on the channel needs to know. So they like those. And many of them are not ham, so they may say, look, we want you to use our radios, and you should, and do so without complaint. Generally, if we're involved, if hams are involved or the government's involved, there'll be an ICS 205 form that lists all the different channels. That's really best practice. And then it's really interesting, directed net protocols that we, I believe, as hams kind of pioneered may even be used on commercial radios or Zello. At a marathon that I've been involved in for more than 20 years, we started putting hams on the 2 rented voice channels. There was one for the course, one for the finish line, just answering the calls, because calls used to go unanswered. We'd answer them, we'd log, and we'd give a timestamp. Okay, yes, we're out of cups, or there's a situation at mile 6 at 10:47, just so someone knew out there. Well, the event actually adopted that and brought in literally a dozen volunteers that sit on now all the different channels at the event, and there's a whole command center set up. So they borrowed essentially amateur radio best practice. They obviously don't use call signs, but on their rented radios, or you can even do that on Zello. So generally in an event, you're not doing standby backup communications. Lecturing the event that the cell phones could get on is all really interesting, but you're doing something really more on the operations side. You're dispatching medical carts, tracking injured runners in a system, getting assistance. So it's a different animal than what you might be used to if you're thinking about the government and sending ICS forms, etc. So it's just, you have to sort of it's a different mindset, and I would argue a different department of ARES. So the best way to practice for a marathon or a 10K, whatever, is just get on a directed net. So your weekly swap net, your information sharing net, just practice checking in. Also getting some net control experience. I would argue once a quarter, so you don't get too rusty. Develop net discipline and clarity. Again, minimal extraneous chatter, which is of course what you do on a normal swap net or whatever. But for these, it's the same technique, the same technology, just a little more brief. So know the basics of incident command. There's a class that I recommend for everyone. It's IS 100. I think it's up to 100A. C, I think, is the last one I saw. But it's just the basic self-study on incident command and the structure. Events might use actual incident command. They might use a light version or none at all. And again, it's kind of up to them. This is not the place to lecture them on textbook methods. And I would argue that incident command doesn't work in all situations for everything by the book. It's a good guideline. It's a framework, but it doesn't have to be imposed on every word and deed at a 5K, for example. And then, but the thing you need to know is who to call, how to call if things go sideways. So if you're out there, at mile 3 and, someone does a face plant on the street, and, that's probably a 911 call. Now, if you've got a medic standing next to you, they're a volunteer EMT or physician, you might say, but, and again, this is up to the event, but generally, at our events, run her down as a 911 call, but if someone walks up and says, hey, I got a blister on my toe and I could sure use a Band-Aid for that, that's probably not a 911 call. But again, you have to sort of look to the event, look to the rules and regulations, look to the published documentation of what's the right thing to do. And then at our events, generally that information then flows, not the specific medical details, but medical care being given at mile 4 or something like goes up the line. So, and again, just knowing, and I always want to know who is in charge, what's the next level of support, just so I know, because you may need it. So dress for the event. There's a tendency to say, look, we're ham radio operators. We've got our, call sign caps and our, club T-shirts and our ARES badges and all that sort of thing. Generally, these events have a signage, they have a branding, they've got sponsors. They stand for something. There's one that's honeybees or strawberries or whatever, and kind of roll with that. Support the event image. The sponsors pay the bills, and frequently, usually, often, volunteers are handed a T-shirt or they're handed a cap, or in the case of ski races, a knitted ski cap. Wear that. If you're a police officer in uniform that day, or you're, a National Guard person or something that's on duty, that's different. But I think the ham should just blend in, if that makes sense. Help where you're needed. This is, again, sometimes shocking to radio operators. Hey, look, I'm a trained radio operator. I've got all these, task books signed off, and they want me to unload the truck. Yeah, you're gonna. Very, very common. You show up at, in fact, we just got told this at our marathon. The doctors were told this, 0600, you're going to be unloading trucks and putting up your own. You're not putting up your own tents, but you're putting up your own tables, unloading your bins of equipment. Very common to show up at 0600, and there's 5 cases of water and some snacks and a box of bananas and some tables, and 1,600 runners are coming in 20 minutes, and you can either sort of complain, or you can just I usually bring gloves and help them set up the tables, and get the bananas out, and get the water available to the leaders, and it's just what you do, and everybody does it. No one's exempt from this, and it's just part of the things. And leadership does notice and appreciate helpful volunteers, and then listen carefully to the coaching from leadership. This is not the time to tell them how to do things. So recognizing medical situations. I think a lot of hams are like, look, I'm here for communications and I don't want to get sued for malpractice. Well, you're not in any case practicing medicine, but you're just observing what's happening. And it should be pretty obvious that something's serious. If someone has, we call it runner down, where they're face down or face up on the pavement, that's probably a 911 call. And again, don't broadcast names or medical information on the radio. There's a thing in HIPAA called the facility directory that says a person and where they are. That is generally safe to provide. So, there's a medical situation at mile 4. Here's the bib number, and help is on the way, or help is here, and that's usually enough to get information to leadership. If someone walks up and says, "Hey, I've got a blister or something," that's a different case. And again, if you've got a medic standing there, they are trained to do the evaluating the situation. If you're not trained, just say, does it look bad or not? Again, this will be in the documentation for the event, and follow the procedures that they provide. There's a government program called CERT, Community Emergency Response Team, that does a lovely job of teaching triage. And there's this notion of red, yellow, green. And again, we're not practicing medicine, and we're just trying to figure out what level of care is needed, and generally get it to them fast, and generally not on the radio. I know our 911 folks, I just literally sat down with the assistant fire chief for the second largest city in Minnesota, and he's like, whatever you do, don't dispatch ambulances on the radio, use 911. So you want to use the procedures that you're given by leadership. This is not our decision. Avoid technical jargon. This is not the place to bring up your talk groups and land mobile jargon and channel occupancy and formal written message traffic. In general, incident command paper forms are not in common use at events. Speak clearly and simply. Support, don't complicate it. Don't lay a heavy technical jargon speech on your race director. A, they're not going to like it. B, they're not going to understand, and probably they're not going to invite you back. Also related to this, don't oversell the hobby. This is not the time to preach about WinLink and Invis or HF or GMRS or whatever the latest fad is. Just solve problems. Someone says, look, number one thing race director wants to know is situational awareness. In my experience, what's going on at mile 4? What happens in the real world is everybody's got a cell phone, and a runner collapses at mile 10. I mean, there's going to be people on the phone, they're calling the media, they're publishing online, that the race director is going to find out within seconds something is happening at mile 12. If we're there, again, we've probably called 911 if we're by ourselves. We don't know. If there's a medic there, okay, runner down, mile 12, medic called, 911 called, they got back up and they need it looks minor. The fact that someone's there, they've reported the situation, and the medical director is aware of it, the race director is aware of it, that's all they need to know. They're good. The panic is gone, the fog of war has been dispelled, versus we don't know what's going on out there, and then all this speculation, and somebody died, blah, blah, blah. It all just spirals out of control, versus very simple factual information. We're solving a problem, we're reliable, we're not trying to get likes on Facebook, we're just reporting the facts. And usually they'll just find that very reassuring and everybody's happy. Be self-sufficient. Don't show up on race day, on race morning going, oh, I need some food, I need some lunches, I need power, I didn't tell you I needed power. I need 12 parking spots in the finish line parking lot. I need, a radio tower. So don't bring all sorts of requests to them on race day. Bring your own tools, equipment, and supplies. Coordinate what you need during the planning. Homemade signs are generally not appreciated because of the whole branding signage thing. On the other hand, after the Boston Marathon, homemade bombs were brought in black backpacks. So bringing a lot of unmarked backpacks, there's this whole notion of, is an unattended backpack a bomb? This is a real thing. So there's a tension between bring a bunch of stuff versus not bringing a bunch of stuff and just showing up with an HT and a battery. And normally there's a procedure for marking equipment bags. So this is a tension, and bringing too much stuff versus bringing not enough stuff is not an easy situation. So keep the radio quiet. Yes, FCC Part 97 does allow remarks on the radio of a personal nature, but this is not the time to be chatting and filling up the radio with just very lengthy and verbose conversation. And actually on digital and trunk systems, you can fill up your time slots. The trunk systems are designed for channel sharing of low usage users, and if you're just yakking away, plus if the channel's busy, then if there is urgent traffic, it can't get through. So just keep it short, keep it professional, use legal ID. There's been some discussions and rulings about, is water stop 3 a legal ID, and generally it's not. You need to use your call sign. Less talk, more mission. The other thing, I have a rule, and I think it's a very good rule. Amateur radio operators must not have radio problems at events. There's a statistic, I think it's like 98% of people in the United States have a cell phone, and that's a radio. And if we can't, be 100% reliable with our planning and, bringing antennas and having the right repeaters, etc., they don't need us. So plan to not fail. Test, practice, study your coverage charts and make sure that we're not bringing a bunch of technical jargon and radio problems to the race director. They're just going to say, why do we need you guys? So just avoid this problem through planning. So if you want to get involved in a new event, approaching them as you need a ham radio and a bunch of jargon and stuff isn't going to work. What has worked for us numerous times is you just volunteer as a general helper. You can be there's a notion of a course marshal where you're essentially eyes and ears at a mile marker. Runners are funny. They're a lot of adrenaline, and they'll if there's like a four-way trail intersection, invariably, even though the signs, they'll go down the wrong trail, and then the one person in the lead, everybody will follow them. So just one of those jobs, or parking, or picking up trash, whatever. Get into the event and then just sort of sniff around and see where there might be a need, and cozy up to the medical director, who has a lot of responsibility, may not have very many staff. And again, they suffer from the same fog of war. A runner is reported down at mile 10. It's a black box. They don't know what's happening there. But if say, nope, we got a ham there. It's it's a skin. It's a minor injury. We know it's a skin knee. The volunteer medic is there. Things are being taken care of versus somebody might have died out there, right? And there's all this, the scenarios and the rumors and stuff, and I think eventually, if we're the best volunteers they build trust, they may promote you into the organization, and, you can say, okay, here's a good use case for ham radio. This is a, 5K in a little tiny park, maybe not the best use case. And then they tell their friends, etc. So it is possible to sort of work your way into new events by essentially embedding yourself, and this again works with the Red Cross, it works with other organizations, embedding yourselves in organizations, being the best volunteer they have. And we can do that very easily. There are continuing shortages of volunteers out there, and we can solve that for them. So closing thoughts. Show up prepared and flexible, represent us well, and thank you for volunteering. There's a lot of feel-good that happens at these events. Everybody's grateful to the volunteers. They say thank you, and it's people keep coming back again and again, and it's really a lot of fun, and it's a chance to show off our skills and build really build our brand of being the most reliable emergency communications, and providing outcomes for these events of route safety, runner safety, participant safety, and letting everyone have fun without injuries. Thanks a lot.